Pity the poor lost world. Despite turning 100 years old this year, the 1925 cinematic version of The Lost World is often seen as little more than a footnote to later films it inspired. A name appropriated by Jurassic Park 2, an ancestor to Godzilla, a preamble to King Kong. It is a movie that begat other movies, but rarely appreciated as a movie unto itself. But despite my channel being primarily a pay-on to King Kong, for me it was The Lost World that came first. It was the perfect synthesis of my love for dinosaurs and science fiction, and my being a goth into old-timey films and Victorian literature. I continue to run the only website devoted to it, even if it hasn't been updated in over a decade. The Lost World was the first full-length dinosaur feature film, and one of the archetypes for all summer blockbusters to follow, but more than that, it's just a great movie all on its own, deserving all the praise heaped upon it when it debuted on June 18, 1925, at Sid Grauman's $1 Million Theater in downtown Los Angeles. To this day, The Lost World remains the most accurate dinosaur movie of all time, based on what science knew at the time. And by a curious quirk of its pioneering special effects, was the first film to really portray dinosaurs as living creatures rather than mere movie monsters who exist to menace the film's protagonists. Since the invention of his masterful detective, the name of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has been synonymous with that of Sherlock Holmes. Yet even in the course of writing his adventures, Conan Doyle resented the literary typecasting. Despite his best efforts, including a knighthood for writing propaganda during the Boer War, the association could not be thwarted. Conan Doyle tried to murder Holmes in 1893's The Final Problem, only to resurrect him by public demand in 1903's Adventure of the Empty House. His best efforts were not in vain, however, as they produced one of the great enduring classics of scientific romance. Pulling together numerous strands of influences, Conan Doyle inaugurated a whole genre in speculative fiction, the Lost World tale, so named for his 1912 novel, The Lost World. Though preceded by the works of Jules Verne and Sir H. Rider Haggard, Conan Doyle essentially perfected the genre with his story of Edwardian explorers trekking into the remote territory at the border of Brazil and Venezuela to find a towering, inaccessible plateau where dinosaurs still lived into the 20th century. The name of his novel became the generic name for the entire subgenre of the Lost World story. Leading the expedition to the Lost World is Professor George Edward Challenger, a bullish ruffian who had little patience for anybody and none whatsoever for members of the press. Short and stocky, with a thick black beard, he was loud, brash, condescending, everything Holmes was not and Conan Doyle secretly wished to be. In fact, the author would dress up as his character and call unawares upon friends in order to test their courtesy. The inspiration for Challenger came from Professor William Rutherford, who Conan Doyle suffered while studying medicine at the University of Edinburgh. We are introduced to Challenger and his overblown claims of living dinosaurs in South America by the reporter Edward Dunn Malone, who is seeking adventure to prove himself to the fickle lady he loves. Malone was inspired by E.D. Morel, a British journalist and a tireless activist who supported the pacifist movement in World War I and joined with Roger Casement in an anti-slavery campaign against the Congo Free State. Casement, in turn, inspired Lord John Roxton, the debonair and aristocratic gentleman hunter who accompanies the Challenger expedition into the heart of the Amazon. After working on the issue of the Congo, Casement turned his attention to the issue of native exploitation in Peru under the auspices of the British Peruvian Amazon Company. These experiences soured him to the exercise of British imperialism, and, unfortunately for him, Casement was executed in 1916 as an Irish Republican traitor to the crown. Thus were the characters. Next to come was the setting. The South American expeditions of Alfred Russel Wallace and Walter Bates up the Amazon, Colonel Percy Fawcett up the Rio Verde, and particularly Sir Everard M. Thurne's expeditions up the flat-topped plateau mountain of Roraima, gave Conan Doyle his inspiration and notes for the perfect location to plant prehistoric life lost to time. Though equipped with up-to-date research through Edwin Ray Lancaster's 1905 book Extinct Animals, what set Conan Doyle writing The Lost World to begin with was a set of iguanodon tracks that had pressed themselves into the petrified clay of Sussex. While England was still a swampy Jurassic wetland, a herd of these earliest described dinosaurs passed within miles of what would eventually be Conan Doyle's estate. The mystique of these proved too much for the imaginative author. A cast of one of the prints adorned one of his mantels, an image of the trackway adorned the cover of the first printing of The Lost World, and a trackway of iguanodon prints, along with their makers, were the first sign of life encountered by the Challenger expedition on reaching the plateau. These influences together resulted in a work of first-rate scientific romance, a well-researched and credible trip to one of the world's most exotic and forbidding locales, and through that, into the ancient past. That term, scientific romance, is more than just an old-timey, outdated term for science fiction. It denotes a different feeling, sensibility, ambition, and style than what we consider science fiction today, which is often merely fantasy and the trappings of technology, or breathless cautionary tales and ideological manifestos that could more accurately be described as anti-science fiction. Originally, the term was employed to describe the new type of dramatic novel by authors like Jules Verne, in the romantic spirit of Alexandre Dumas or Walter Scott, novels that were scientifically minded, celebrations of exploration and technology, unapologetically adventurous, and sometimes daringly futurist. In this genre, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World excelled. Some might argue it was even the last great scientific romance before the disillusioning onset of the Great War. With the elements of authentic personalities, real-life expeditions, and current paleontological research, Conan Doyle wove together a time travel story without a time travel machine, recounting the distant times of dinosaurs, ape men, and humanity's conquest over the primordial past, for the benefit of readers as hungry for adventure and romance as Ned Malone himself. The result was one of the greatest literary classics of all time, all of which translated into its first feature film adaptation. Because, of course, a story so pregnant with adventure, thrills, horror, and imagination immediately attracted Hollywood's attention. The story of The Lost World on the silver screen begins with an unrealized version first developed by early film pioneer William Selig. All that remains of Selig's unmade film is a synopsis, a scenario up to the end of the first reel, a potential cast list, and a handful of storyboards, all of which reside in the William Selig papers and the special collections of the Margaret Herrick Library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Beverly Hills, California. Through these, we can see a version that is very different from the novel, but which is evolving toward the film that ultimately was released by First National Pictures in 1925. In the synopsis, Professor Challenger returns from South America with documents from his deceased friend and fellow scientist Maple White, proving the existence of an antediluvian lost world that survived Noah's flood, upon which dinosaurs still reign. Ridiculed by the establishment, Maple White's daughter Gladys can't rest until she can vindicate her father. So troubled is she that she even refuses to marry her fiancé, Eugene O'Brien, until she returns from South America herself. Here we see the first of the most common changes made in adaptations of the story, namely, inserting a female protagonist into Conan Doyle's boy's own adventure. Notable in the prospective cast list were Lewis Stone as Roxton and Bull Montana as an ape man, roles they would fill in the film that was made. Selig probably scooped up the rights to The Lost World as soon as the book was published, or not long thereafter, and then sold them when he liquidated his studio's assets in 1918. J.G. Wainwright and Cine Productions obtained the rights to The Lost World from Conan Doyle in 1919 for £500, and this option was subsequently bought out by producer Watterson R. Rothacker in 1922. Selig's biggest hurdle was how to realize the fantastic prehistoric creatures that the story demanded. But luckily for Rothacker, he found just the genius to do it. Willis O'Brien is a name that goes down, rightly, in the annals of cinema history as a true special effects pioneer. He made many films, but is most remembered for his work on The Lost World, King Kong, and Mighty Joe Young. Born in California in 1886, O'Brien held a variety of jobs and hobbies during his formative years. Two of these would stand out and foreshadow his later career. First, serving as a guide to paleontologists in the Crater Lake region, and second, sculpture and illustration. One day, while making models with his friend, an idea was born. Young O'Brien recognized that he could animate the models on the same principle that cartoonists use to animate drawings. By building a model and then moving its parts one frame of film at a time, he could give the models cinematic life. O'Brien was so certain that this art form would take off that he went about creating a test reel to sell the idea to producers. In determining a concept for this test reel, O'Brien lit back upon his other love, prehistoric creatures and paleontology. His crude test reel about a caveman fighting a dinosaur led to The Dinosaur and the Missing Link, a prehistoric tragedy in 1915, the comedic story of Neanderthal prenuptial dilemmas. This film was later seen by Thomas Edison, who promptly bought the rights to it and hired O'Brien to produce more shorts, including Morpheus Mike, Prehistoric Poultry, The Dinornis or Great Roaring Whiffenpoof, The Birth of a Flivver, RFD 10,000 BC, and Curious Pets of Our Ancestors. On the strength of these short films and other educational films he produced with Edison, a producer named Herbert Dolly hired O'Brien to animate a lengthier dinosaur film titled The Ghost of Slumber Mountain in 1919. Unfortunately, the original 45 minutes of the film were trimmed down to 16 minutes, and though it made $100,000 at the box office, O'Brien's paycheck stayed at a relatively meager sum. Plus, Dolly took all the credit for the dinosaur animation. Prospects were looking down, but this film was the best thing that ever happened to O'Brien. Hollywood knew who did Ghost of Slumber Mountain, and producer Watterson R. Rothacker hired O'Brien to do the animation for The Lost World. O'Brien quickly realized that what he had been doing up to that point was inadequate for a motion picture spectacular such as this, not the least reason being the ambitious number of models required and the large sets they would be animated upon. The climactic dinosaur stampede sequence alone required a spectacular 150-foot-long jungle landscape. The solution would come in the person of Marcel Delgado, a bag boy and art student who O'Brien lured with the princely sum of $75 a week. For inspiration, Delgado went to the paintings of Charles R. Knight, the father of modern paleontological restoration, who worked out of the American Museum of Natural History. By virtue of this relationship with the paleontologists of his time, Knight's paintings were as accurate as science could make them at the time, and this worked its way into The Lost World. Delgado's models, 49 or 50 foot long, latex covered, ball and socket armatures in total, were exact three-dimensional representations of Knight's paintings. As I said before, Dinosaurs of the Lost World remain, to this day, the most accurate ever seen in a movie based on what science knew at the time. The very fact that The Lost World's stop motion was primitive and pioneering gave it an unexpected advantage in retrospect. With O'Brien's craft being much improved by the time he started making King Kong in the 1930s, he was better able to integrate the human cast and the dinosaurs, resulting in the advent of the movie monster, who seems to exist for no other purpose than terrorizing the protagonists. Because this was simply not possible when The Lost World was made, the dinosaur scenes tended to be dinosaurs attacking each other, while the human protagonists looked on. Many scenes of direct human-dinosaur conflict from the book had to go unrealized, but in their place was, for all intents and purposes, a dinosaur documentary showing prehistoric monsters in actual, if voraciously violent, ecological relationships. It would take cinema decades to revisit this kind of verisimilitude. But despite the proven success of O'Brien's skills, there were still misgivings over using them on such a large scale. In response, the Lost World screenwriter, Marion Fairfax, created a script that would still make a passable adventure story even if there were no elaborate dinosaur scenes. This would earn her the eternal contempt of O'Brien, who ultimately got the last laugh. Not only did O'Brien's dinosaurs work well, but the centerpiece of Fairfax's non-dinosaur version has since been lost. A 20 to 30-minute sequence of the Challenger expedition fighting hostile cannibals in the Amazonian jungle, unceremoniously dropped to the cutting room floor in favor of the dinosaur scenes. Surprising validation for O'Brien's tedious but masterful stop-motion work came from no less than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself. In 1922, Conan Doyle was on a lecture series in America, trumpeting the cause of spiritualism that he picked up in the years following World War I and the death of his son Kingsley. During the course of this tour, Conan Doyle's good friend Harry Houdini invited him to the annual meeting of the Society of American Magicians. Despite being close, their friendship was frequently tested by Houdini's deep-seated skepticism of spiritualist claims. He and his fellow magicians spoke out a great deal against psychic frauds by replicating their phenomena with theatrical conjuring. Anticipating more of the same at the Society's meeting, Conan Doyle prepared a little trick of his own. Bringing in a movie projector, he offered no explanation of what the magicians were about to see. The following day, the New York Times ran the headline, "Dinosaurs cavort in film for Doyle. Spiritist mystifies world-famed magicians with pictures of prehistoric beasts. Keeps origin a secret." The day after, the New York Times ran Conan Doyle's letter to Houdini, which explained that his presentation was a special effects reel from The Lost World. Overnight, Conan Doyle made the film adaptation of his novel the most anticipated movie in America. Unfortunately, not even a day had passed after that famous Society of American Magicians meeting before both Conan Doyle and Watterson Rothacker found themselves threatened with lawsuits. Herbert Dolly claimed that the patent for stop-motion model making belonged to him, and that his techniques had been stolen by Willis O'Brien. As if that weren't enough, Hollywood's only female producer, Catherine Curtis, came forward claiming that Rothacker sold her the rights to The Lost World for $35,000 in July 1920. Noting that she was prepared to invest another $100,000, she said that she had no idea there was a dispute over the rights until she had read about Dolly's suit. In a trend that would continue through dinosaur cinema, it was obvious that the dinosaurs were going to be the stars of The Lost World. Nevertheless, the antediluvian monsters of Maple Whiteland would require a living Challenger expedition to square off against. Filling their shoes were burly Wallace Beery, perfectly cast as Professor Challenger; Lloyd Hughes, more than adequate as the youthful Ned Malone; Lewis Stone looking every bit the dapper gentleman hunter as Lord John Roxton; Bessie Love whimpering through her role as Paula White; and Bull Montana as the lone ape man, joined by a well-developed cast of animal actors. And joining the main cast and the animals were reportedly an additional 2,000 extras, 200 automobiles, and 6 omnibuses for the grand finale in the streets of London. However, the movie did bring back the wrong dinosaur. The original novel had Challenger come back with a live pterodactyl, but the movie promised the voracious Allosaurus running amok, Godzilla style. Instead, the film climaxed in the larger but less obviously predatory Brontosaurus. Bringing the dinosaur back to civilization rounds out the dinosaur movie archetypes which The Lost World contains within it. In the heady dinosaur summer of 1994, in the immediate wake of Jurassic Park, legendary comic artist and writer Steve Bissette published a list of the 4 dinosaur movie archetypes in the pages of his comic Tyrant. These archetypes are the story that takes place in the past, like Fantasia's Rite of Spring sequence or the Walking with Dinosaurs documentaries; the Lost World story, of which The Lost World is the most obvious example; the time travel story; and the story in which the prehistoric monster intrudes upon modern civilization, such as King Kong or Godzilla. I would argue that the time travel story and the Lost World story are really the same type, just by a different mechanism. Both involve taking modern man out of civilization and thrusting him into the domain of the dinosaurs, the modern man intruding upon the past. Conan Doyle's Plateau, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Island, or Jules Verne's Center of the Earth are just a means to time travel without a time travel machine. The Lost World is such a clear example of this archetype that it even lent its name to it. But the film's scenes of dinosaur against dinosaur conflict also give it the character of a story that takes place in the past. And finally, bringing back the Brontosaurus brings the monster into conflict with the modern world. So it's not even that The Lost World is merely the first dinosaur feature film or merely the direct precursor to King Kong. The Lost World is the genre-defining giant monster film that contains all giant monster films within it. The Lost World is not the rough draft of some later film. All later films are derivative of The Lost World. RKO Pictures even purchased The Lost World as a precaution because King Kong was basically a remake with a giant monkey. And like all genre-defining films, artists, or musicians, The Lost World also transcends its genre to stand alone and above everything to follow. While many of its derivations may do one thing or another better, or add something new or different to the genre, none do everything as well and as archetypally as The Lost World. Principal filming was done on First National's patch of the Brunton Studios, a Hollywood establishment renting sound stages and space for smaller studios without their own property. First National would move out into their own studios in 1926, and Brunton was then purchased by Paramount in 1927. The lot still exists today as the famous Paramount Studios on Melrose Avenue, abutting the former RKO studio where Willis O'Brien returned to film King Kong. The live-action sequences finished filming in 6 to 8 weeks, and after 3 years of tests and production, The Lost World was finally completed on February 2nd, 1925. At a cost of $1 million, it was one of the most expensive films of its day, compared to $200,000 or less for the average silent movie. But the investment paid off handsomely, with over $4 million in worldwide box office receipts. The gala premiere of The Lost World took place on June 18, 1925, at Sid Grauman's stunningly gorgeous $1 Million Theater in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, on the corner of 3rd and Broadway. Just over 10 days later, The Lost World was reported breaking attendance records at the Million. The New York Times declared, "Through wonderful photographic skill and infinite patience in the camera work, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fantastic story, The Lost World, makes a memorable motion picture." The Los Angeles Times proclaimed that the tang of a real adventure fills the theater from the very start of the film, and it arouses at times gasps of wonder and amazement. Technically, it is so startling, in fact, as to be hailed as a masterpiece. Movie Weekly threw up its hands, saying, "We have ceased wondering how the picture was filmed. We simply accept it as one of the cinematic phenomena of the day and give unstinted praise to its author, director, research worker, and photographer." Picture Play magazine faintly praised it for having the great merit of being something new. If it falls down, at least you can only say that its worst moments are not more than the commonplace movie. The Washington Post expounded, "Here is a picture that has never had a counterpart in the history of silent drama. In it has been reproduced and animated with astounding realism the terrifying animal life that is reputed to have existed on this earth 100,000 centuries ago. Pterodactyls, Brontosauri, Diplodocus, Trachodons, Triceratops, Allosauri, Megalosauri, and all other horrendous creatures that measured hundreds of feet in length and towered into the air like our present-day skyscrapers." And my favorite movie review of all time, from Canada's Toronto Star, pontificated that "The Lost World returns in all of its fantastic fabulosity of prodigiously unreal realism. This opus of Conan Doyle's out-Julesing Verne, for improbability presented with all the veracity of a solemn melodrama, is one of the most challenging pictures ever seen here. It was made to test the credibility of any average audience, not merely to galvanize the museum. And in Toronto, the film's original 6-day engagement at the Regent Theatre was held over for 3 weeks. Thanks to the hard work of everyone involved, from producers Watterson Rothacker and Earl Hudson, director Harry Hoyt, effects crew Willis O'Brien and Marcel Delgado, writer Marion Fairfax, and the cast of human and animal actors. The Lost World was a critical and box office success that transformed cinema and left an enduring legacy in every dinosaur movie and summer blockbuster to follow. Even 100 years later, it still astonishes us with its primeval terror and technical innovation.